Mom's sick, so I came instead." The words arrived before the child did, small and plain, like someone announcing the weather. Ethan Carter looked up from the cup of coffee he had been turning with his fingers, the steam making a soft halo in the cool morning light. The bakery bell chimed as the door opened. Rain dotted the glass. He had rehearsed a dozen polite greetings in his head, the kind of lines that fit across a candlelit table and a polished hand, but the reality that stepped through the door was a little person in a yellow raincoat, hair tied in a single stubborn pigtail, holding a tiny paper bag with both fists. For a moment, the room held its breath. The regulars returned to their newspapers and laptops, but not entirely. The staff exchanged looks that read like footnotes to a new story. Sophie stepped around the display case as if she owned the path and walked straight to Ethan's chair without bothering with the empty seat opposite. She set the paper bag down, peeled back one corner, and offered him a half slice of pie, as if offering a truce. Ethan blinked. The pie was warm. Steam had braided with the coffee scent. There was a smear of whipped cream on one edge, dolloped sloppily and tender. The kid's eyes were brown and uncannily steady. "My mom said you were nice," Sophie announced, as if that explained everything. Ethan's first instinct was to reach for his wallet, for the reflex that had shaped most of the transactions in his life. Pay for dinners, tip well, fix what could be fixed with a transfer. He felt the familiar tug, do something financial to smooth the awkwardness. He suppressed it. The child did not need money. She needed recognition, someone to take her offering and to meet her on that particular ground. He accepted the half pie. He lowered himself to her level, not to condescend, but to properly receive the gift. "Thank you," he said. The words felt insufficient and honest at once. Sophie sat, not in the place the date would have occupied, but on a little stool near the display case, and immediately reorganized the tableware like a captain setting order to a small ship. She inspected Ethan with the blunt appraisal only a child could offer. The cut of his coat, the slight fray at the cuff that told of hands that had done something other than gestures for meetings. The gentleness in his eyes that sat like an apology yet unclaimed. She was a small human polisher, smoothing out his edges with an unblinking gaze. "Do you like whipped cream?" she asked. And when he said he did, she stabbed a spoon and shoved a dollop at him with the ferocity of someone who understood generosity at the level of survival. Laughter loosened from Ethan at that, the sound of a man surprised to find himself laughing like a person returned from some long exile. The bakery hummed back into motion. The espresso machine breathed. A heater gave a low, steady whisper. Someone at the counter asked for more scones. Outside, the rain kept time. He had come because a friend, Olivia, a colleague of a colleague who lived in the same city and had apparently sensed he needed an easy moment, had arranged a blend date. Ethan had pictured an adult conversation that polished itself into the comfortable contours of small talk. He had not anticipated having to answer to a 4-year-old's earnestness, and he found the surprise deliciously disarming. Sophie asked another question. "Are you sad?" It landed between them without being rude. Children had the unadorned bravery of truth. Ethan had rehearsed answers for the expected curiosities: career, favorite vacation, resume-level confessions. But grief was not one of the things he planned to serve with coffee and pie. Grief had settled into him like a room-steady hush. It was not the kind of thing you could pay for or even apologize for. It had been his roommate for the last few years, a quiet presence since the accident that had taken his younger sister, a private, ever-present smallness. He did not evade. "Sometimes," he said. "Do you think adults cry the same as kids?" Sophie considered, mouthful of pastry. "No. Then, after a beat, they cry more quietly." When Emma arrived, tall enough to be a presence, but moving like someone run on a half-charge battery, she looked like the person who had been sacrificing sleep for a small constant. Flour dusted the cuff of her sleeve, a faint fingerprint of her trade. Her face was blunt with exhaustion, but not without a softness that greeted Sophie from across the room. She stopped in the doorway and took him in,
The coat, the coffee, the way the child sat as if this was the most ordinary meeting in the world. "Sorry," she said to Ethan, breathless with apology, not to the child. "Traffic, my phone." Her voice thinned and then steadied. She crossed the room with a confidence that suggested she had learned to calibrate herself into the spaces life offered. The conversation that followed was quiet and careful. Emma's laugh was rare and bright when it came, like a bell struck after a delay. She watched Ethan with a friendlier, more wary appraisal than Sophie. He watched her back with the same restraint he used for investments and people: measure, listen, then commit if it felt worth it. Their talk braided around small things: the bakery's oven that never seemed to stop, the way Sophie would arrange muffins for display as if they were an audience, the bookstore 2 blocks down where Emma went when a recipe needed testing. Words about grief came up the way tides do, softly and then with a gentle pull. Emma's grief was not a theatrics of sorrow. She spoke of nights that had stretched too long, and of a husband who had died 2 winters earlier. No melodrama, only fact. The way a ledger lists entries. She said that some days the morning began in grief, and that other days it began in recipes. Her fingers worried a napkin between sentences.
She was careful with herself. Pride hidden like a valuable under the mattress, never flaunted. Ethan listened. He did not offer solutions, no glossy vows to fix everything. Instead, he told a small thing that signaled his own losses, that he had once found solace in organizing other people's lives because it gave him a perimeter over chaos. The admission was short. It was not a plea. The shared recognition, 2 different kinds of brokenness meeting over coffee, tilted the air in the room. They found one another in the grammar of absence. Sophie, who had been mildly engaged with a paper napkin castle, suddenly announced, as if performing an absolute civic duty, "Make my mom laugh." It was a mission statement. The bakery air rearranged itself around the simplicity of it. Emma's smile faltered, the way a room's lighting might shift when someone turns a dimmer. She said nothing, but she let herself be observed. There is a peculiar honesty in the way children name objectives. They do not hedge with syllables of possibility. They declare. They act. Sophie had decided, and in declaration there is a kind of momentum. The first emotional block closed not with any theatrical gesture, but with the steady accumulation of smallness. Shared pie, a spoonful of whipped cream on a man's lip, a woman's tired laugh drawn out by the ridiculousness of a napkin castle. The moment felt like an explanation of how ordinary things reorder a person. Kindness made of time, not headline-making charity. If stories like this warm your day, consider tapping like. The plea was unobtrusive, a small note against the back of the scene, and then life resumed its rhythms. The city outside was uneven with rain. The bakery's bell kept working at small chimes. But something had shifted in Ethan's chest, a softening, not miraculous, more like thawing ground. Over the next week, the meeting was a quick pivot point, nothing more heroic than a seed planted in an overfull pot. Ethan went back to his office, and to meetings that smelled of citrus and paper, to a world where decisions landed with the clean certainty of contracts. Yet, between conference calls and flights, a memory of a small hand offering half a pie began to fill otherwise empty corners. He found himself checking the bakery's opening hours on his phone, the way an amateur gardener checks the weather, with hope he tried not to name. He noticed, too, that small things began to press against his days: a late afternoon at the board and the image of Sophie's earnest face. An unexpected call that he let go to voicemail, but then replayed, because the voicemail contained Emma's voice, answering to some neighborhood order or a supplier. He began to understand that presence, more than any well-timed intervention, was what people needed. There is a humility in watching someone you barely know carry on and deciding to show up. It's not dramatic. There is no single scene of decision, no grand speech. In the following days, Ethan did what he could with deliberate smallness. He visited the bakery twice more, always in the rawness of plain clothes. No announcement, no public noticing. He bought croissants and left payment with a napkin note signed only with his initials. He learned Emma's favorite pastry and asked for it as if ordering for himself rather than as a calculation. The staff started to nod at him, a communal, cautious welcome.
Once he learned the rhythm of the place, he began to notice the micro-pressures that made Emma's life unsteady. A cracked delivery truck that complained in the alley at dawn. An oven that misbehaved at the worst possible minutes. Sophie's winter coat with a frayed cuff. He noticed the landlady's visits, brisk and businesslike. The way she paused longer than necessary at the counter and asked about the rent with the kind of attention a ledger grants. These were ordinary pressures no one trophy could repair when you were up to your neck in them. Ethan had money, always a dangerous sentence, but showing it felt complicated. He wanted to help without staging a transformation. So his kindness took the shape of small, quiet alignments. He did not arrive with a check held like a salvo. Instead, he did the things that could slide along like small gears in a larger machine. He listened to a contractor's recommendation and made a call that set a repair in motion. He ordered a crate of flour to be delivered under a different name. He answered, once, when the bakery's main oven died at dawn, and texted a technician who would come that afternoon. Each action was private, tidy, and anonymous when it had to be. He valued dignity. He knew that dignity could not be bought, and that money was only a tool, worth little if it humiliated or made a person feel beholden. There was no fanfare about it. Emma continued to rise early, put on her apron, and experiment with new fillings. She continued to accept help, sometimes with a tight-lipped thank you, and other times with a quiet, surprised gaze that she did not feel obliged to explain. Ethan saw those looks and matched them with a kind of patience measured in coffee refills rather than speeches. The small things multiplied into a kind of tapestry. One afternoon, on his way back from a meeting, Ethan found the rain had decided to be obstinate. He saw Emma through the bakery window, stooped to wrangle an umbrella that had snapped. Sophie was holding on to the counter with both hands, watching with the serious commitment of a little person deputized to be in charge. Ethan pulled his car to the curb and walked through the rain, not to announce himself, but because the act of opening an umbrella across someone's head felt like the simplest kindness in the world. He offered the umbrella, and she allowed him to hold both theirs. It did not read as rescue, it was mutual jostle of two people trying to keep dry.
Sophie squeezed between them, and for the first time Ethan's hand brushed the child's small shoulder. He crouched by instinct, steadying himself to speak on an equal plane, and Sophie looked at him like he had always been an available person. The public nature of the gesture, hands, an umbrella, wet shoes, made it practical and safe. They drove slowly through city streets that blurred in the rain. The car was plain. He kept the tabletop order inside, nothing flashy to announce who he had been when he left home. He asked about a shipment Emma had mentioned, and she answered with the kind of distracted focus that comes from someone who thinks about needing schedules more than about themselves. The conversation turned to Sophie's insistence that certain muffins must be displayed on the lower shelf because their height mattered. Emma laughed at the logistics as if the details themselves were a sanctuary. Their route was short. He pulled up outside a block of brownstones where a woman with a clipboard and even sterner shoes met them on the stoop. She was the landlady. She had the diary of the building written in her face. Date circled, identical payments noted, small grievances filed like receipts. "You're late on the kitchen repair," she said, not unkindly, but with the authority of someone who regarded payments as the backbone of a relationship. Emma explained about the oven, the delivery delays, the technician who had been scheduled. The landlady's posture softened for a beat, then shifted back to business. "I'll need assurance that this won't be ongoing." Emma's hands folded into each other. She negotiated in the short, pragmatic sentences of someone who had to make peace with an account that never balanced perfectly. There was no shame in her words, only the flatness of someone who had learned to keep their dignity intact by refusing to dramatize their needs. Ethan felt the old reflex stir again, the wish to fix. He found his voice and spoke simply. "If you want, I can arrange for a contractor to come tomorrow." He did not expect to be heard. The landlady looked at him and then at Emma. "If you can cover the part that's on you," she said, "we'll have it done." Emma's look to Ethan was private. It could have been gratitude or surprise
or the brief confusion at being offered help by someone whose face was still being categorized in her mind. She declined to put him in a spotlight. She said, politely, "I'll handle it." Ethan said, "If it helps, call me." He left the number, but not with any flourish. The offer had the quality of a hand extended without expectation. There were other possibilities in the days ahead. He could have made payments visible, paid the rent in a letter, signed and delivered during a breakfast where the landlady's face would read astonishment. He could have parked his car outside and arranged a small ceremony. He resisted. The delicate balance felt like a test of character. Help that preserves the receiver's agency is not help wrapped in a ribbon. It's help that allows someone to keep the arc of their life in their own hands. It was his small, anonymous interventions that began to accumulate into a pattern. A package of groceries appeared on Emma's doorstep some mornings with a note, "For busy days, E." A technician that had seemed hard to book showed up as if by a previously arranged fate. A day-long shortage of sugar resolved without any bill being left on the counter. Each act was like a private stitch. Emma opened the grocery bags and touched the notes like a person checking the hems on a new garment, careful, guarded, and with the faintest smile. One Saturday, feeling bold in a way that has nothing to do with wealth and everything to do with habit and hope, Ethan lingered in his car across the street from the market as Emma shopped. He watched her choose apples with the intensity of someone who negotiates with produce like it is quality control for a small life. He watched Sophie at her side, holding a little list scrawled on a noodle of a receipt. There is a particular ethical whisper in watching someone from a distance and acting anonymously on their behalf. The help is meant to be unobtrusive. He packed a bag of food, a bunch of simple, nourishing items, and left them near Emma's doorway with a short note. No fingers pointing, no large hand waving. Then he sat in his car and watched from the other side of the street, not to gloat, but to keep the posture of a guardian who wants to be unseen. Sophie dragged Emma toward the bag the way a small person drags the moment of gift into the future. Emma paused before touching it, the pause that says more than any word can. Dignity and suspicion and a longing for help that does not require humiliation. She opened the bag and found the note. For a beat, she read it, and then the camera of attention, the city, the small distillations of ordinary life, slid to Ethan's car. He sat there, hands folded, not looking like a benefactor, but like a man with a quiet responsibility. Emma's eyes flicked up and found his. She did not wave or call across the street. She simply nodded, a small, private acknowledgement. Ethan drove away before she could do more than fold the moment into the pocket of her day. The anonymous act had the potential to become a pattern, one that could be read in different ways. For Emma, it was helpful. For him, it felt like keeping a promise to himself, to be present without making anyone feel indebted. He did not want her to feel beholden. He wanted his presence to be a steady background, like the heater hum in the bakery, noticed if noticed at all, and there when needed. But people are not comfortable with invisible hands. Human dignity often insists on reciprocity. It is the beat that keeps relationships honest. Emma's reaction to the gifts was complicated, gratitude threaded with discomfort. She kept the notes folded away in a drawer next to recipe cards, as if trying to keep them in the same place where she stored instructions for life, both the delicate and the urgent. Sophie, on the other hand, wanted to find the person who sent the bag and declare that they were the best grown-up who ever existed. "What if it's a fairy?" Sophie whispered one afternoon, conspiratorial and wide-eyed as she led Ethan and Emma back into the bakery after school. She believed in small magics, crayons that always found their missing partner, scones that rose just so. Or a superhero, Emma supplied with a lightness that felt like someone testing cartilage. Her smile was protective, a small lid over a larger tide. Ethan simply smiled. He liked the idea of being a background superhero. He liked the low drama of ordinary rescue. It suited him better than any headline. Their days began imperceptibly to nestle into each other.
Sophie would set a chair near Ethan when he came in, as if assigning him a permanent role that neither adult had yet signed off on. She would make him a drawing with an oversized sun and 3 stick figures, one with a tie and the other 2 with skirts and pigtails. No labels, just 3 people. The picture would appear on the counter one morning, propped against the tip jar like a small declaration. People in the neighborhood began to notice them as a small constellation rather than as a headline. The bakery staff took to saving the corner croissant. The barista left an extra chocolate on the plate. The landlady's visits remained businesslike, but there was a gentleness in the way she asked about the oven. The world adjusted to their pattern, the way a river adjusts to a new stone. And still, there remained the cautious distance that both guards and tests whether something could be true. Emma never let him into the back rooms where the boxes of flour rustled. She kept her ledger guarded and her good nights private. He respected that boundary like a muscle learning a new exercise. The most telling test came not in large confessions, but in a moment of small embarrassment. One evening, as they closed, a customer left a generous tip with a note that read, "For the best bakery and the bravest woman." The staff erupted in warm congratulations. Emma's face turned white and then red, troubling at once. Sophie, who had been stacking pastry boxes, walked over and took the tip envelope, then marched to the door and announced, "This belongs to us and to the neighbors and to the kitty, too." She had decided, in the forthright logic of 4, that money could be distributed. Emma laughed, the sound spilling out of her like a small thing given more space to breathe. She accepted the note with a look that said she would figure out what it meant later. In the way that happens, trust stitches itself in the tiny and the ridiculous. The day's pressure eased, not because someone had solved everything, but because a community had chosen to hold a little of the weight. For Ethan, these moments accumulated like breadcrumb trails, the way Sophie's small authoritative gestures read as rehearsals for trust, Emma's cautious softening as she allowed herself to be laughed at in public, the landlady's softened questions. None of it was epical in isolation. Together, though, they started painting a picture of what life might be if someone simply kept showing up without headline-seeking drama. Yet beneath the accumulating smallness, there was an undercurrent of practical friction that had to be addressed. Bakeries have margins that are thin as pastry layers and less forgiving. The oven had been the most immediate pressure, but other things ticked in the background. A storage unit overdue, a delivery route log that showed occasional missed shipments. These were the things that no shared joke or pie alone could smooth. It was in the middle of one ordinary week that the next test arrived, not with trumpets, but with a landlady's clipped voice and the long, unavoidable fact that sustenance sometimes wears down even the most inventive diets of hope. Emma stepped out of the bakery for a moment to take a call. Sophie rearranged the display with solemnity. Ethan lingered, watching the pattern of her hands as she folded pastry paper. A man in a worn suit, the kind that looked like it had been chosen for function more than for pride, walked in. He introduced himself smoothly as a representative of a utilities company, his voice circular with practiced politeness. His questions were clinical: dates, invoices, reason for interruption. He glanced at the day's notice taped behind the counter. The landlady was due back by afternoon with answers. Ethan felt the old reflex again. He sat still. He could have remarked to the clerk that he'd be happy to call in the favors that would smooth this out. He did not. He watched as Emma navigated the conversation with the quiet competence that comes from someone who does not have the luxury of losing focus. She negotiated a temporary extension, promised a payment plan, and made a call, all with the steady moving of someone who had built a life inside margins. After the visitors left, the room returned to its routine hum. But the quiet tension did not dissipate entirely. It hung like humidity in the air, a slow pressure that would not be erased by a single generous act. That evening, as dusk folded into the city, Ethan made a decision that would be small in scope but large in intention. He did not want to make a spectacle. He wanted to keep Emma's pride intact while removing a pressure that seemed unnecessary. He called a number he found in a contractor's directory and arranged for a technician to come the next morning under an anonymous name. He sent an email to a supplier, not to advertise, but to reroute a delivery that could sit in place and keep the ovens running. And then, as if to keep the balance between help and autonomy, he left a note at the bakery that read, simply, "You're good at this." He signed it with his initial. Days like pins were stuck on Emma's calendar. Appointments, deliveries, the small, unromantic scaffolding of life. When a neighbor opened the front gate the next morning and announced that someone fixed the oven, Emma thought the sky had shifted color. She walked in and found the technician packing his tools with the practiced look of someone who had been briefed. The oven hummed. She touched its surface like a person visiting a reliable friend. She found the note that had been left on the counter and read it twice. Her face loosened. There was no dramatic change in her life overnight. The bills still arrived, the landlord still kept her accounts in sight. But for a day, the pressure eased enough that she baked a new tart without the usual edge of fear in her hands. Ethan watched from a distance, because that was his style. Not present to claim, but present to ensure continuity. He was not a savior. He recognized that the language of heroism did not belong here. He had wealth, and that allowed him options. But his gestures were designed to be as small as possible, the kind that slid in and out of someone's day without intruding. There was a reason he had been comfortable with that approach. The harder moments in his life taught him something about dignity and the quiet work of being useful. You only truly help if you preserve the other person's sense of agency. He had lost a sister in an accident years ago, and the grief had taught him to value the ordinary rhythms of care. That loss had not been dramatic in a cinematic way. It had been an unignorable absence that reshaped his mornings. It made him slow to act with spectacle and quick to act with utility. And yet, even as he cultivated caution, he felt a growing stake in their small constellation. The stakes were not grand. They were the sorts of stakes you find in ordinary human commitments. A change in who shows up, who makes soup when the nights are long, who takes a child's small hand in crossing a street. He was beginning to count these small stakes as real. On the day the groceries first went missing from the doorway, Emma's reaction was not immediate panic, but a sober recalibration. She had left an envelope on the counter with a note asking for a week's grace on a bill. When she returned from the market to find the envelope gone and a small crumpled note in its place that read, "Taken care of, .e," she stood for a long moment in the doorway as if deciding whether to allow space for relief. Sophie danced around her feet with the kind of impatience a child has when the adult world moves slowly. Emma folded the note and tucked it into her ledger. Afterwards, when the staff crowded around the counter to finish a batch, she moved like someone shifting to be ready. She did not announce who had done it. She kept the mystery intact as a personal thing. It allowed her dignity to remain. Ethan watched all this play out like a man who had learned how to be careful with other people's lives. He did not want to be a footnote in their hardship or a signature in a ledger. He wanted to be a steady, anonymous force. He also knew that anonymity has a limit. It cannot build the infrastructure of family by itself. That would take conversation and consent, two things Emma valued and would not hand over lightly. Still, the pattern was forming. People in the neighborhood began to whisper about the anonymous kindness that hovered like a steady weather pattern. Groceries left, a technician that arrived on time, a paid invoice that seemed to appear in the quiet. Rumors are the human way of explaining the kindness of strangers. Some called it luck, others called it community. A few guessed a benefactor. No one guessed what Ethan secretly felt. Relief, yes, but also a burgeoning sense of responsibility that had nothing to do with money. He had committed himself to being present because, in the quiet ways he had learned to care, showing up mattered. The story was still young. It had the rawness of a life being stitched in daily thread rather than embroidered in grand design. That was the shape of his attention. Not a rescue, not a transplant, but a slow reclamation of ordinary days. The next morning would hold a new test.
The landlady had called the bakery in the afternoon and made the kind of comment that read like a ledger entry with teeth. Accounts need attention. Emma had rearranged the counter, gathered invoices, and smiled the neutral smile of a manager. But the atmosphere remained taut, like a string ready to hum if plucked. Ethan felt the thrum in his bones as if someone had struck a note. He stood across the street when Emma stepped out again to take a call. She was brisk, businesslike, and then she froze when Sophie tugged on her sleeve and pointed toward a bag left by the step. Emma picked it up, read the card, and her face, which had been guarded, altered with emotions that moved too quickly to be named in a single instant. Ethan's car idled at the curb. He had not intended to be visible. He had left the bag the night before and then had sat across the street to make sure it had been found. But seeing Emma's reaction, stunned, perhaps relieved, perhaps a little bewildered, made him realize that his anonymous help had consequences. It offered comfort but also introduced questions. He watched as she unfolded the card and read the words that had been written in neat, unassuming script. She scanned the street, and then, like a decision that chooses privacy over acknowledgement, she tucked the note into her pocket and moved on. Sophie skipped ahead, humming an invented tune about a bakery with sunshine.
As Ethan pulled away from the curb, he felt a small, quiet thing in his chest, like someone closing the lid of a box and deciding not to pry it open. He had done what he could for that day. The pattern could continue if he let it, but patterns demand conversation eventually. People and dignity do not thrive in perpetual anonymity. They crave recognition, consent, and time. He did not know that the next test would force exactly that conversation. He did not know yet how deep the threads were beginning to weave between them. He only knew that when a person takes the trouble to show up, whether with a pie, a text, a technician, their presence can become an undercurrent that starts to pull the shape of a life into a new configuration. The city moved on around him. Rain had turned to a steady mist. The bakery bell jingled as someone left with an army of boxes in hand. Sophie's laughter trailed behind them, bright and insistent like a promise. Ethan drove away and thought of small things. Whipped cream on a lip, the way a child's mission can break a careful adult wide open, the humility of giving without fanfare. At the corner, as he waited at a light, he checked his phone and found a message from Olivia with a single line. How was the blind date? He stared at the question and smiled in a way that surprised him. That, he thought, was an honest question, and he had an answer that was beyond explanation, but not beyond truth. He typed nothing. Instead, he parked and walked across the street to the little park where Sophie liked to swing. The swings squeaked with the small, bright music of childhood. He watched her for a long time before he folded himself onto the adjacent bench like a person who had learned to be patient. He watched Sophie swing, and it was in that watching that he realized how quickly things could become more than the sum of single moments. He was not ready for a storybook ending. He did not want one. He wanted the messy, honest accumulation of days where people chose each other, not because fate forced them together, but because kindness was practiced like a muscle. He wanted to see if he could be present without subsuming the other's agency, if he could build something that respected autonomy and also offered shelter. A few blocks away, Emma turned the page on a ledger and thought, for a moment, of the future as a list of small actions. She wrote down the oven maintenance check, the supplier's contact, Sophie's school holiday. She held the note in her hand and then tucked it alongside the recipe where she kept the measurements that never changed. The city was a collage of small choices. Sometimes the most unforgettable encounters begin as interruptions. A child who shows up instead of her mother, a man who accepts a half slice of pie, a woman who lets herself be quietly helped. The events are not seismic, they are ordinary, and because of that ordinariness, they feel possible to do again, to be handed forward. On the street, Ethan drove slowly past the bakery one more time and then pulled into a spot across the way, unconsciously aligning himself with the next step even before he named it.
He watched Emma through the window, counting time in the small domestic rhythms she had already established. The way she measured sugar, the way she straightened a girl's hair, the way she wrote notes to herself and tucked them away. He decided to stay present and to let the presence accumulate into something that might, with patience, become a new kind of ordinary. He had not yet offered to stay. That was a conversation for another day, and one that would require the kind of courage, not of spectacle, but of consistent practice. For now, there were small acts and small answers and the quiet building of trust. He sat in his car and breathed in the city, and a plan settled into his mind not as a lightning bolt, but as a steady intention, to be there in the small ways that matter. The next morning, Emma found an envelope tucked beneath the bakery doormat. It contained nothing that would explain itself as life-changing, only a note, for when you need a day to breathe. She kept it folded in the pocket of her apron and touched it at moments when schedules made breath scarce. The gesture preserved her agency. It also touched something tender under her ribs she had dared not trust. Across town, Ethan looked at a crayon drawing propped inside the bakery window and thought of how children say the truth plainly. He thought of the way Sophie had offered him half a pie, as if offering part of what she had was an act of diplomacy. He thought, too, of how simple presence can be a kind of reparation, slow and steady and private. There was a long way to go. There would be talks and boundaries, and days when being the person who showed up would be inconvenient. There would be moments when Emma would test whether help meant strings, and moments when Sophie would declare someone "daddy" as if the word could be slipped on like a hat. For now, there were only small, crucial steps: a pie shared, an umbrella offered, a bag of groceries left on a doorstep. Those were the measures of a life in progress. And yet, the day's last scene closed on a quiet, unsettling note. The landlord had mentioned the word "final" in a way that meant the bakery's ledger could be read either as history or hinge. Emma had a stack of invoices and the kind of hope that requires attention. Ethan sat at his desk that evening and could not quite fold the day into the shape of normality. He collected his keys and drove back to the bakery. He did not intend to unveil himself with trumpets or lights. He parked, left the engine running, and watched as the bakery's evening lights cast a warm amber rectangle onto the wet pavement. Inside, Emma stacked boxes, and Sophie slumped in a chair, eating a small muffin, content as if a small universe had been arranged.
Ethan stayed in his car for a long moment, feeling the weight of his next move like a practical thing to be measured. Then he turned the engine off and walked to the door, hands folded. He had always believed that quiet things do the most work. He pushed open the door and stepped into the bakery's warmth. The bell chimed a familiar note. Emma looked up, surprised. Sophie waved, as if this were exactly what the script had always required. "No need to be surprised," he said, and took a breath that smelled of coffee and the small possibility of commitment. "I came to see if you were okay." Emma's expression shifted. She closed the gap between surprise and steadiness with the practiced throttle of someone who keeps emergency reserves for private use. "I'm managing," she said, the words small and true. "Some days are better than others." He nodded. The bell above the door chimed as if to punctuate the plain truth. Sophie, who had been quietly rearranging sugar packets into neat pyramids, looked up and declared, as if summing up the world, "You came. That's a good start." Ethan felt the thickness of something like relief and something like dread both at once. He had not planned to reveal more than an offer of help. He had certainly not planned on confessing that he'd been the invisible hand in several small kindnesses. But the look on Emma's face, guarded, curious, not resentful, asked for honesty. He folded and unfolded his hands as if arranging a napkin. "There's something I should tell you," he said. "You've probably noticed things. Groceries, a technician showing up, repairs done faster than you'd expect." He watched her reaction for only a moment before continuing. "Those were my doing. I wanted it to stay anonymous because I didn't want to change how you worked or put you on display. I wanted to help without making you feel indebted." Emma's mouth shaped a question she did not say aloud. Sophie, sensing adult tension as only children do, climbed into Ethan's lap and wrapped her small arms around his neck. It was an action both forward and utterly simple. Ethan braced himself as if that small weight were the most consequential thing he had ever been asked to hold. "You didn't have to do that," Emma said finally, neither accusatory nor praising. Her voice carried the careful cadence of someone naming an arrangement she had not themselves proposed. "We appreciate help. She stopped, searching for the wording that would hold both truth and dignity. "I appreciate that you wanted to be careful." He looked at Sophie's earnest face, at Emma's steady hands, at the flower still clinging to her wrist like a badge of continuity. "I wanted to make sure you could keep baking without worrying that one bad week would erase the next," he said simply. "I know what it's like to have a quiet thing inside you that never quite heals. I don't want to fix what grief did. I want to be present." Emma considered him. There was a long, contained pause. No speeches, no grand promises, only the air in the bakery rearranging itself. She rested the palm of her hand on the counter, close enough to Sophie to anchor the child's confidence, but not so close as to close off the possibility of something else. "You could have told me," she said. The sentence was plain. "Or you could have asked if I wanted help." "I could have," he agreed. "I thought I was protecting you from feeling beholden. I realized that was presumptuous. I'm sorry." He let the apology land and then moved forward with a different offer. "I don't want to be anonymous anymore. If you let me be, useful in ways you accept. I'll come help with deliveries when you need it. I'll pick up Sophie from preschool some days if that's helpful. I'll call a contractor and make sure the oven's serviced. But I'll do it when you want me to, not when I assume you do." Emma's eyes softened on the syllables of his offer. He had spoken with the same restraint he used in meetings. No flourish, only concrete terms. That steadiness mattered to her. It signaled an intention that did not try to erase her labor, but to partner with it. "And what do you want in return?" she asked, an almost wry note threading the question. "Nothing except time and the chance to be a person you can count on," he said. "No strings, no dramatic gestures." He looked towards Sophie, who was busy coloring an improvised crown out of a receipt. "And you can call me whatever Sophie wants to call me. I'll answer." Sophie looked up at the word whatever and, with the unfiltered logic of a child, decided on immediate action. "Call him Daddy," she said, as if it were a weather report. The entire bakery held its breath for half a second, the way a room does when a note hangs unresolved. Emma's cheeks flushed, not with embarrassment, but with the slow warmth of someone facing an unexpected possibility. Ethan neither laughed nor recoiled. He touched Sophie's hair with the tenderness of someone who had practiced gentleness in private. "If she calls me that," he said softly, "I'll take it seriously. It's not a title I'll use lightly." Emma's laugh then was quiet and layered with a shock of something finally named. "You realize she means it now," she said, shaking her head with a smile that looked like it had been stored for weather like this. "She's decided things before breakfast." The rest of the evening unfurled in the manner of people testing new ground. They talked about routines, Sophie's favorite bedtime book, the exact temperature for the oven's custard tart, which streets had potholes that required detours. Ethan listened and offered practical help without overriding. He learned that Sophie's school let out at 3, that she loves blueberries on pancakes, and that Emma slept fitfully on nights when orders were due at dawn. He offered to take over the grocery run on 1 day a week. She declined the next time, accepted the week after. Their agreement took the shape of small choices, negotiated and revisited. Before he left that night, Emma reached across the counter and clasped his hand in a brief, not entirely private squeeze. The touch was a seal on a new arrangement rather than a contract. "Don't do anything showy," she said. "Please?" "No show," he promised. "Just being here." The days that followed were not a montage of miraculous change, but of steady, visible presence.
Ethan kept his promise. He arrived on a Wednesday to help move a pallet of flour and stayed to knead dough with clumsy competence. The staff laughed at his inexpert fingers, and Emma's patience, scarred by years of doing things herself, softened in small increments as she taught him how to fold pastry without destroying the layers. Sophie took to him in the way children decide on their own expeditions, by test, by reward, by repetition. She would pat the stool beside her and say, "Sit here and watch me," as if assigning him the role of witness to her kingdom. He learned the exact shape of scalloped cookies, how to size a muffin top, and the secret of a custard that never curdled. He learned, too, how to do the laundry, how to change a light bulb without asking, how to show up with soup on a night when baking deadlines doubled. On a gray morning, when the city smelled faintly of rain and the heater hummed a steady note in the bakery, Ethan walked Sophie to school. It was a weekday ritual now, a small curving of routine in their week. The playground buzzed with children and their parents. Parents clustered like weather systems, and the preschool door opened with a little flurry of boots and backpacks. Sophie, who had lately embraced the authority of her small domestic monarchy, marched forward, holding Ethan's hand like a person making a declaration. As they reached the classroom doorway, and as a butterfly of activity circled them, she turned to the teacher without hesitation. "This is my daddy," she announced, in the same tone she used to order extra sprinkles. The teacher blinked, then smiled in the professional way that assumes stories are fluid and families are many. Ethan felt warmth spread over his face, but did not flinch. The label hung between them, light, imperfect, uneven, and somehow it felt right. He crouched to Sophie's height and straightened the strap of her backpack. "You want me to pick you up?" he whispered. Sophie nodded solemnly. "And on Sundays we have pancakes." "Deal," he said, and sealed it with a promise as simple as a handshake. Emma watched from the bakery window as they walked away, a soft, private observation folding into the ordinary hum of her day. She felt the small, steady terror and the strange, quick relief of allowing someone into the perimeter of her life. To trust was to risk being relied on, she thought, but it was also a soft opening toward a life that might contain more hands than hers alone. Their domestic days knit together in quiet, ordinary patterns. Ethan learned to set a nightlight gently beneath Sophie's bed, leaving it on low to ward off thunderstorms. He learned the exact drawer where Emma kept extra cookie cutters. On Mondays, he drove Sophie to a music class and then sat in his car reading until she finished, the heater humming like an obedient animal. Emma began to leave a pot of soup warming on slow after late nights. He would come by and eat with them and do the dishes, never making a spectacle of his gestures. There were tensions, natural, not tragic. Emma could not imagine giving away her autonomy for any security, especially not quickly. She guarded the ledger where bills lived, and she wanted to be the architect of the bakery's future. Ethan respected those boundaries and encouraged conversation instead of directive. When Emma worried aloud about being seen as someone who had been bought a way out, he would repeat quietly that he did not intend to substitute for her agency, but to expand the space in which she could operate. This was part of his vow, for himself: presence, reliability, consent. It was not an instantaneous cure. They argued sometimes over hours. What counted as help? What counted as interference? He learned to step back if she needed to do something alone. She learned to take the day off without guilt when exhaustion, long a steady companion, forced her hands to slow. Sophie's candidness continued to catalyze the adult truth between them. One evening, as raindrops made little percussion on the window panes and the oven gave off a comforting, pillowy warmth, Sophie climbed into Ethan's lap on the bakery couch and announced, plainly, "You can be my family." It was not a declaration that demanded legal forms or calendar dates. It was a child's assertion that people who show up can be counted upon. Ethan blinked, felt the strange soft tug in his chest that had never quite been named as longing, and answered simply, "I will try my best." The days folded into months with the harmless gravity of habit. They celebrated small victories: an extra order fulfilled on time, a new tart recipe that worked, a landlord's nod that meant the account was stable for now. They endured small setbacks, a shipment delayed, a broken mixer, a week of slow foot traffic. But the pattern of being present built a scaffolding around ordinary life. Emma's laughter grew more frequent, not theatrical, but resident, like a new plant pushing through pavement. Ethan's smiles became less private, more available. Then the inevitable conversation arrived, a moment when future and past met and asked to be named. They were closing late, wiping down counters, when the light outside had thinned into the color of damp wool. Sophie had already been put to bed. Her muffled humming floated down the hallway like a small comet passing the home's orbit. Emma sat at a corner table, fingers idly tracing the rim of a mug. Ethan poured them both tea and set the kettle's tin song to rest. He did not ask how to start.
He only said, "We should talk about what this means." She met his gaze. She had been thinking the same thing. She did not want silence to become an unspoken agreement. "I don't want something that will disappear in 6 months," she said. "I don't want promises that are easy to make and hard to keep." "Neither do I," he replied. He considered the words for a long second, then reached under the counter with the same sort of deliberation he used in a boardroom, only this time the stakes were different. He took out a small pastry box, wrapped with a bit of twine. He had brought it in the morning like an ordinary contribution, one of his quiet rituals. But now he opened it on the table between them. Inside, resting on crinkled parchment, was a simple band. It was not shimmering ostentation. It was a modest ring, a plain circle with a small matte finish, not designed to attract attention, but to be noticed when handled. Alongside it, in the corner of the box, sat a small note. "I want to be here. No grand promises, just presence. E." Emma's eyes widened, but the widening was not purely surprise. It was the recognition of someone choosing, concretely, to be present. The ring meant various things to various people. For some, it means ownership or ceremony. For others, a vow. Ethan had chosen to frame it as the latter. "Are you proposing?" she asked, the question threaded with equal parts humor and gravity. He smiled in a way that carried the weight of many quiet transactions. "I'm offering a choice. I want to be with you and Sophie, if you'll have me. I'm not asking to fix what's been broken, or to erase anything. I'm asking to be part of the everyday, to be the person who shows up to school recitals, who hands you a towel when the oven burns your hand, who sits with you when grief comes. I want to build a life with you by practicing love day by day. And if you don't want that, I'll walk away." Emma held the box and turned it in her hands the way you study a recipe you might follow but are not yet committed to. She thought of Sophie's crown drawings, of the nights when the bakery felt like a thin skin between them and hardship. She thought of Ethan's restraint, of how he had insulated her dignity even while easing her burdens. She felt the ledger in her chest, the accounts of small favors and small betrayals balanced on a shelf. Then she looked at him, at the unassuming man who had kept his coat frayed at the cuff, who had learned how to fold pastry without fuss, and she found herself considering the possibility of trust. "Yes," she said finally. The word was small and solid. She set the ring back into the box, not as possession, but an emblem of a chosen future. "Yes. If by yes you mean we figure this out together. If by yes you'll keep asking permission to help. If by yes you'll show up even when it's inconvenient." "I will," he said. The vow had the inflection of someone who understood that love is an accumulation of unremarkable acts. They did not kneel or parade a proclamation. They did not stage a cinematic moment with staged music and choral crescendos. Instead, they finished their tea, washed the mugs, and turned off the lights. Sophie woke sometime during the night and stroked Ethan's cheek with the certainty of a child who had made a good choice. She said, in the fog of sleep and trust, "Daddy?" Ethan's answer was a soft, awake yes, And he meant it in the way he had meant things all along, with deliberate presence and without presumption. Weeks became a rhythm of shared mornings and negotiated boundaries. They learned how to share space without erasing the autonomy each guarded. They argued about paint colors for the bakery's window and compromised on a soft, honest shade. They learned which days to hire the extra hands and when to try to juggle orders themselves. They taught Sophie how to carry a pie box without letting the corners slip. They purchased a small frame and took a photograph one late afternoon. 3 people sitting on the bakery bench, flour dust on one shoulder, a crumb on someone's lip, Sophie's grin bridging the adults. The photo was simple, no staged smiles, just a captured truth. Ethan made sure that their financial transitions were discreet. He helped with bookkeeping on evenings Emma asked, not by taking over, but by offering tools she chose to use. He paid a bill once, in private, after a long conversation about whether she wanted him to. He respected her decisions about which invoices to pay and when. Their partnership settled into the steady work of living, shared tasks, occasional friction, mutual repair. Months later, the landlord, who had been at first a figure of ledgered pressure, smiled from across the counter and complimented Emma's new tart. "You're doing well," she said, the compliment carrying a grudging warmth. The world did not change form, but it softened at the edges. Sophie grew into her new certainty. She declared Ethan's cooking as very good and performed impromptu concerts where he was the only attentive audience. She sometimes called him Daddy in public, and sometimes E, depending on which felt easy that day. Both adults let her name him as she needed, knowing naming is a child's way of claiming safety. One late summer afternoon, when the shop smelt of lemon and the city lights slanted gold across the counter, they pinned a small photograph on the bakery wall. It was the one Ethan had taken in a quiet corner, 3 faces caught in a brief, unadorned truth. Beneath it, Emma wrote in black marker a short line and stuck it with washi tape. "Our sweetest recipe, presence." The sentence had the plainness of a recipe and the depth of a vow. People who came into the bakery read it and smiled. Some customers asked how the family came to be. Others simply noted the new warmth in the air. No one needed to be told the whole story. The proof lived in the mundane. Sophie setting a plate at the counter for an adult who had been late. Ethan fixing a squeaky hinge without being asked. Emma laughing at a small joke and meaning it. Their life remained rounded by ordinary pressures. There were days when worries crept back like mold, and there were bills that arrived like proofs that life did not permit too much ease. But when those days came, they faced them together, negotiating, planning, resisting the urge to dramatize. Ethan's role was